Okay, we will go ahead and get started since we have a packed agenda for us today. Welcome, everyone, to our climate conversation. The topic today is voting for resilience in the upcoming general election. This afternoon, we're going to focus on California Proposition 4 and why this bond is critical for the state to adapt to our changing climate, reduce the risk of catastrophic disasters, and protect our communities. I'm Allison Chan. I'm the political director at Save the Bay, and you may have noticed that this event is being presented by Save the Bay Action Fund, along with our co-hosts from SPUR, Greenbelt Alliance, and the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Save the Bay Action Fund is an affiliated political organization of Save the Bay that promotes ballot measures that support a Bay Area that's resilient, clean, and healthy. For everyone to thrive in a time of rapid climate change, the Bay Area needs to do a lot to prepare. We need to restore our shorelines to protect against rising sea levels. We need to build climate-resilient infrastructure and more affordable housing close to jobs and services. We must invest in roads that support bicycles, pedestrians, and public transit. And we need to provide universal access to open space and nature. Save the Bay Action Fund endorses ballot measures at the state and local levels that support this vision, and we're very excited to be supporting Proposition 4. Hopefully, most of you have already received your ballots in the mail, and you're here because you're doing your research to fill out your choices. To learn more about Save the Bay Action Fund and review our full ballot guide for the November election, please visit sfbayactionfund.org. In addition to reading about the local measures that we're supporting, there are also resources on that site to help you or people you know if you haven't received your ballot in the mail yet. We have links to confirm registration status or find a voting center where people can vote in person, even if you didn't register in advance, because California now offers same-day voter registration. So like I said, today we're grateful to be joined by some incredible leaders who are helping to shape how the Bay Area grows to meet this challenge while also continuing to foster a strong economy and provide housing to address the affordability crisis. At any point, if you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function to submit them. We'll work to answer as many as we can, and we'll also follow up on any that we aren't able to address this afternoon in an email. But before we launch into all of that, I'm going to ask my colleague, Josh Quigley, to give an overview of what Prop 4 is and why it's needed right now. Josh, please take it away.
Thanks, Allison. And thank you all again for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll run through a little overview of what Prop 4 is and what it's going to fund. And then we'll welcome our panelists to join us for the discussion of how the measure will benefit the Bay Area and hopefully, again, answer a lot of the questions that you may have about the proposition. So climate change is obviously already having tremendous impacts around the country, like we've seen recently with the devastating hurricanes and flooding in the South. And different parts of the country are experiencing these impacts in various different ways. Here in California, wildfires, as we know, have threatened not only the majestic landscape of the state, but they're also having devastating impacts on our communities, on our air quality, and on wildlife habitat. Prolonged droughts that we've seen over the last few years and the loss of the Sierra snowpack are creating challenges for how to maintain our drinking water supplies across the state. And the Bay Area has unique vulnerabilities, including the threat of flooding from sea level rise, from more intense storms, and from groundwater rise in the coming years. In fact, more than 2/3 of the state's expected flood risk from flooding from sea level rise is located here in the Bay Area, where we have tens of thousands of vulnerable homes alongside roads, schools, businesses, and more that's all built close to the shoreline or in low-lying areas where flooding is going to be increasing in coming years. But rather than waiting for what we know is coming and then reacting to a crisis, voting yes on Prop 4 allows us as a state to make proactive investments in prevention to better protect our communities from these risks. So how does it do that? Well, Prop 4 invests $10 billion over the next 3 to 5 years in a wide range of existing and effective programs that will reduce these risks by adapting our cities, by our infrastructure, and the natural environment to be more resilient. Making these investments now helps California maintain its status as a safe and healthy place to live into the future. And these investments, as you can see, they include more than $3.8 billion for water supply, $1.5 billion to better manage our forests to prevent wildfires, $1.2 billion each to both secure our coastal areas to make sure they're resilient to sea level rise and protect natural lands and preserve wildlife habitat. Additionally, there's $450 million to prepare communities for extreme heat by planting shade trees and creating green spaces in cities, as well as building cooling centers. And the bond will also support new clean energy investments, help small farms conserve water and improve soil health, and build resilience into our state parks. And again, most of this funding would be routed through existing state agencies to support programs that we know are effective, but where there isn't currently enough funding to meet the demand. One example of that is the state's Coastal Conservancy. This is a state agency that funds shoreline restoration and water quality improvement projects, including many of the large marsh restoration projects here in the Bay that we're particularly interested in as shoreline advocates. It's actually been incredibly effective at managing these large projects like the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, which is the largest wetland restoration project on the West Coast. And this little video is showing that restoration in action as the tide was reintroduced to an area of restored marsh last December. Now, these types of projects are important because restored marshes are part of the regional strategy to protect adjacent communities from sea level rise and flooding by creating natural buffers between the land and water. But the Coastal Conservancy can only move as fast as funding will allow, and that's true for all of the agencies that are helping to build climate resilience. Currently, the Coastal Conservancy has identified projects that are ready for construction, but require more than $600 million in new funding. And unfortunately, the state budget this year led to a lot of large cuts to climate and environmental programs at a time when we need to be doing more of this work to prevent future disasters. And that left the Coastal Conservancy without new funding to invest in projects around the Bay. So this map is actually showing all of those projects that are ready for funding, but where the projects themselves will be delayed without a new source of money. And that delay means that our communities remain vulnerable longer. So for those of us in the Bay Area worried about these types of risks, Prop 4 is providing part of the solution. So to finish with this example, if Prop 4 is passed, it would actually provide the Coastal Conservancy with more than $700 million in new funding that it can immediately put to work on building projects that enhance the shoreline, provide flood protection, and create wildlife habitat and recreational opportunities. But even with new funding that Prop 4 would provide across the whole range of climate adaptation categories, we still have to be strategic about where we invest those funds because the need is obviously going to continue to be far greater than what Prop 4 can fund. So ensuring that those funds get to where they are needed is one of Prop 4's key strengths. Many vulnerable communities have long suffered from neglect, and racially discriminatory policies like redlining have often pushed disadvantaged communities into more vulnerable areas. One of the key elements of Prop 4 is that it will actually require that 40% of the funds are targeted specifically at disadvantaged areas. And you can see on the slide here some of those disadvantaged areas in the Bay Area that would be prioritized for that funding. Now, this broad approach that Prop 4 takes and the way that it's targeting funding through effective programs and into the areas of greatest need is why we're seeing so much growing support for it. Prop 4 has received endorsements from firefighters, water supply experts, business leaders, labor leaders, many more, hundreds of organizations have endorsed. And we're seeing that support continue to grow. So I'll stop there. That is what Prop 4 is. And now I'd like to turn the spotlight back to my colleague Allison to start our discussion. And joining Allison, we're very happy to have back for her second climate conversation, Assemblymember Diane Papan from San Mateo. Assemblymember Papan represents the 21st Assembly District, which includes the entire bayside of San Mateo County from Brisbane to East Palo Alto. In the Assembly, she serves as the chair of the Assembly Committee on Water, Parks, and Wildlife, and that gave her a leading role in crafting the legislation that authorized Prop 4. In addition, she has long championed ways to improve our infrastructure and build climate adaptation into our communities, including her previous service on the board for the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resilience District. So we're grateful to have her leadership on climate and glad to have her join us this afternoon to talk about how Prop 4 came together and how it will benefit the Bay Area. So Allison, take it away.
Thanks, Josh, and welcome, Assemblymember Papan. Good to see you again, and thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your leadership on this. This was a challenging year to take it on, a challenging budget year, and that budget reality led to large cuts to climate adaptation programs at the state level. But at the same time, the legislature put Proposition 4 on the ballot, to many of our delights. So why did the legislature prioritize this bond now? Can you tell us a little bit more about thinking that went into that?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, bless you, Joshua, for giving us that overview, because I forget all the nitty gritty of it. And I'm delighted to be with all of you today to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, certainly, and something that I think is imperative to the state of California. So, many of you might know that this concept of a bond was in the works even before I got to the Assembly. And there were many advocates, such as many of your listeners today, who were involved in sort of the formulation of this bond. So this year, there were two vehicles for a bond. There was one in the Assembly and one in the Senate. And so the Senate was working diligently on what they thought theirs might look like. And I was part of a sort of select committee to take a look at what the Assembly vehicle looked like. And we took it on because, you're right, there were budget cuts to a lot of work that I sort of felt certainly needed to be done. And I kind of felt like, it seemed like the Senate was working very diligently. So I was probably one of the ones, myself and a few colleagues, that were very instrumental in wanting to make sure that we were having meetings and we were doing the tough work to put together whatever the vehicle looked like in the Assembly side, so that if there was a go, and there were a lot of bonds that were talked about. There was an education bond. There was a housing bond. There was another bond that kind of dealt with ag, which was sort of, I think last time we talked, and it was parts of that were folded in to this climate bond. So I felt that the governor was very much like, I'm going to give you the education bond, and if you guys can put it together on the climate bond, okay, I'll consider it. And I was like, okay. And it wasn't that the entire caucus was necessarily on board. I mean, there took some convincing, but I was really glad that our study group, our working group with staff, got together and we pushed it and we formulated it in a way that we just kept working until the time was right. But I kind of feel that even if we stop polluting in the morning, we must be resilient now. Climate change is upon us. There is certainly a need for speed. So irrespective of what happened at the budget level, we needed to make sure that we continued funding for very important infrastructure. And this is, as Joshua pointed out, there are a lot of projects that require a lot of money. And I consider this really to kind of be a down payment on the climate resilience work that we need to do. But the urgency is now, as we see, every summer is hotter and hotter than the last one. Then we have these storms that cause flooding, and we're not properly managing the water, which is partly why I really wanted to be chair of Water Parks and Wildlife, because I kind of feel like not only is it about resilience in my district, but what do we do with the surplus of water, and how do we manage it up and down the state? So anyway, consequences are upon us with climate change, and I'm so glad that ultimately every Democrat in the Assembly voted for but for one, and we even got some Republicans to join on at the last minute, and we got this. It was eventually the Senate vehicle that came forward, but I was so grateful. I mean, I remember people challenging me on the Assembly floor. I mean, you really think, how is this going to pass? And where's the money going to come from for it to pass? I said, those enviros, they'll come forward. You watch. I was very optimistic, but I remember.
And we are.
Exactly. I think. And I remember having some very difficult conversations. I was like, you will vote. In the end run, you will vote for this. And they did. So here we are today. And I want to thank all the folks that have joined us today, because I hope they'll be out there fighting the good fight.
Well, you are obviously convincing. And to repeat your own words back to you, actually, from the Prop 4 press conference that we all many of us participated in last Friday, climate change is here and it's time to adapt. And I think that that's a really telling statement that doesn't take us away from our climate mitigation priorities at all, but refocuses some of that energy toward making sure that we can adapt to what is here and what is coming in the future. And I'm so glad to know that, a fierce advocate like yourself had such a direct role in negotiating the bond and urging our colleagues forward down this path. So as you were in those negotiations, what kinds of priorities were you really floating for your colleagues, both in the Assembly and in the Senate, to focus on for this bond?
Well, I mean, as I think about this region, for sure, the biggest things for me were obviously shoreline protection, huge one, and then also the fire resilience. Those were probably the two biggest ones for this region. And there was some, I'm going to give you the nitty gritty. There was some, regional battling for sure. And but in the Bay Area, we have something like $230 billion that are at risk to sea level rise. And a lot of those assets, if you will, are not only very important infrastructure, whether it's roads, whether it's wastewater treatment plant, but it's also companies that are the economic engine of this region, of the state, and I would submit the nation. So, I had some folks from Southern California telling me that I had to be very careful because of this, that, the other. And in my mind, I'm thinking, you think Hollywood holds a candle to the deals that happen in our district? I don't think so. But I didn't say that. I'm afraid. But nonetheless, I don't think that we can underscore the economic importance of this region and how vulnerable so many of, big assets, big companies that keep our state and our nation going have to be protected. And then, of course, all of the infrastructure that keeps the employees going to either live here or to commute here or whatever it may be. So I was really focused on, first and foremost, let's talk about the sea level rise and how that would impact so many of our communities. In my district, as you mentioned, I was part of the One Shoreline and the creation of One Shoreline because, as it turns out, the county that I represent is the most vulnerable in the state to sea level rise. So I was really focused on getting those dollars, certainly. But then also, you had the CZU fire in Santa Cruz, and the recovery from that has taken an inordinate amount of time and will continue to invest in recovery in those areas, but we lost a heck of a lot. So the fire part of the bond, which is a very good sell, if you will, is also incredibly, incredibly important. So those were the things that I was thinking about as we were, putting things through the grist. But as I will tell you also as chair of Water Parks and Wildlife, certainly clean water was a part of my passion. And as you mentioned, $3.8 billion of this bond goes towards clean drinking water. Now, we don't necessarily have huge issues with drinking water here in the Bay Area, but it is something that helps all of California, stay the fifth largest economy in the world. So I do think it's something that we must be conscious of, certainly. But I'm excited about some of the restoration that the bond calls for because it will do things like, develop tidal wetlands and living levees and those kinds of things. And then you get the benefit of also protecting against flooding. I mean, it's amazing to have that double benefit. So this bond is well tailored towards some very, very constructive infrastructure needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've teed up Nadia Anderson's remarks for tonight very well. So, I think our audience will benefit a lot from the additional information that Nadia will share on the economic importance of this measure. And also you touched on, the fact that drinking water is a big piece of it. And what that brings up for me is how much of this bond is about helping disadvantaged communities. And, the great thing about it is that it actually sets aside specifically 40% of the revenue for disadvantaged communities for projects of all kinds. So why was that important to you and your colleagues in the legislature when drafting this bond? And can you talk a little bit more about how the emphasis on disadvantaged communities will help the Bay Area? Maybe not as much around the drinking water piece, but certainly around other elements of the measure. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about the set aside for disadvantaged communities and how we'll experience those benefits in the Bay Area?
Certainly. Well, I think it kind of goes without saying that wealthier communities tend to be a bit more resilient, right? Because they can afford to tax themselves to be more resilient. Actually, I think it was that it started out at a 30% figure, and then towards the end of the negotiations, it went to 40%, and there was zero objection to increasing it to 40% of disadvantaged communities. Because again, it is very tough for disadvantaged communities to try to fortify themselves against climate change. But the question is, how do you define disadvantaged communities? And it was I was very clear all the way along that it would have to be 80% of the area median income rather than the state median income. Because if it was the state, there would be very little for disadvantaged communities in the Bay Area. Now, being a disadvantaged community certainly looks different here than it does, say, in Bakersfield, but that doesn't make you any less disadvantaged. If you lose your home, it is going to be devastating. Especially for where I come from, East Palo Alto is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. They lose their homes, we're in real trouble. And so I felt that the 80% of area median income was a fair way to do this. Certainly a lot of tax dollars to repay this bond will be coming from wealthy taxpayers in my community, but we can, we're the land of the haves and the have-nots, and we can't just leave the have-nots behind and not make them equally as competitive for some of this grant money to do some of these infrastructure projects, which are incredibly expensive. So I felt that it was the fair thing to do. Most of my colleagues did. The Senate vehicle already had 80% area and median income. The Assembly one had the state. But I was very clear all along that you would have to, be fair to communities in the Bay Area who needed just as much protection as anybody else. So I think we landed in a good spot. I think it will be, given how much is coming from our area. And I just want to mention, for every $1 billion in bond, the debt repayment annually is $80 million. And that was part of the hard sell for this, because we have a budget deficit. And then people kept looking at, well, if we have certain amounts that we have to pay every year, you're really almost, they would say to me, you're cutting our general fund budget every year by doing this. So it was a bit of a hard sell. One of the ways that we were able to sell it to some of our colleagues is you don't go out immediately for the $10 billion. So what that means is you're not necessarily going to have to repay $800 million in interest payments every single year. These bonds they go out over time. But there is the repayment, and certainly we will be a donor to that. And I feel the 80% of median area income is a way that we make sure that we're still providing for those that are disadvantaged, perhaps in the wealthier communities, but doesn't mean you're any less disadvantaged for your area. Long story long.
No, that's helpful to understand. It's information not widely shared, so I think the audience would appreciates that. I do want to ask, when we're talking about the types of programs that this money is going toward, there's a lot of confusion about this bond will generate funding and who's going to spend it and how. So what we do know is that the bond funds mostly existing programs. We're not creating any new bureaucracy here. So programs like the State Coastal Conservancy that Josh mentioned a few minutes ago are going to receive the revenue from this. So, how does that address any questions around sort of fairness, accountability, and impact across the state? Obviously, you have a Bay Area focus, and your colleagues have their focus in their district. So, can you talk about how the way this bond works by funding existing programs, how that addresses sort of a fairness and accountability element in this bond?
Well, first of all, we started out with $16 billion, and then there's if this is the maximum amount of bonds that the state can issue, we're at about here. And so we only really had about 20 billion to play with. That's why we ended up with a limited number of bonds. And then they came down in price. So education bond had to be 10 billion. And I was actually surprised that the climate bond got 10 billion, because when we were doing our work, we were actually focused on it being an $8 billion bond. So the 2 billion kind of got added back in over no objection from me. But in any event, because this thing had been kicking around for a while, the Assembly one in particular, the Assembly vehicle, had a lot of earmarks. And that wasn't going well to keep those earmarks in. And even like the likes of the Bay Restoration Authority getting money, people were looking at like, well, there's too much going to the Bay Area, Papan. We're not sure about that. But the minute they learned that the Bay Restoration Authority is a taxing authority, and we have taxed ourselves to make these investments, I will tell you, any objection to that money, specifically saying Bay Area Restoration Authority, went away. So real easy sell. And but we had I met with some of the Central Coast Assembly members, and they were feeling like they had been overlooked. And that's when they were really focused in on the Bay Area Restoration Authority. And so anyway, we highlighted the importance of this is not just about us getting money from the state. We have been realistic enough to fortify ourselves right now. But you're right. We did want to, once we went down a different method, which dealt less with earmarks, although the Salton Sea stayed in there. That was a big one that people had issues with. I had less issues. I mean, I was okay to earmark money towards it, but it was really big to start. And we had to kind of, throttle back a bit in order to be fair to everybody else. But what happened was we started going more towards issues and challenges rather than specific projects. And with that, Allison, you're right. We went to established agencies who we knew could be accountable, who would be competitive in the bidding process, and who could really get the job done. And that's where agencies like the Coastal Conservancy came into play. They were sort of natural repositories for money should they be competitively bid and get the various funding. It really came down to less earmark, more about challenges, and let's see where the chips fall as far as when people apply for the money.
Great. Well, I really appreciate all that insight. I wish we could keep talking, but I'm excited for you to join the rest of the panel in diving even deeper into some of these issues. So I will turn it back over to Josh.
Thanks, guys.
And we will keep talking.
Yeah.
Thank you, Assemblymember Papan, for joining us again. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists who are going to join us for the second part of our discussion, where we'll talk a little bit more about how the specific investments are going to benefit the Bay Area. So joining us tonight from the Greenbelt Alliance is Jordan Grimes. Jordan is the State and Regional Resilience Manager at Greenbelt Alliance, where he works to advance sustainable land use policy, as well as address the impacts of climate change here in the Bay Area. Also joining us is Sarah Atkinson, who is the Hazard Resilience Senior Policy Manager at SPUR, which is a nonprofit public policy organization that works to create an equitable, sustainable, and prosperous region through research, education, and advocacy. And last but not least, we have Nadia Anderson, PhD, who serves as the Chief of Staff and Senior Vice President of Policy, Strategy, and Operations at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, which is the nation's most effective and dynamic business association representing the economy here in the Bay Area. So thank you all for joining us today. And I think, we talked a little bit or more extensively so far about sea level rise. We're going to get into a few other issues as well that all relate to Prop 4 and the need to build resilience. But I guess just kind of wrapping up that topic, I'd really like to just kind of get any additional perspectives that you all have. So given your organization's focus and area of expertise, why do you think that flood risk here in the Bay Area in particular is a critical investment for voters to support now? And that's for anybody who wants to jump in and kind of start things off.
Yeah, I can jump in. Thanks so much, Save the Bay, for hosting this. Thank you, Assemblymember, for joining us in this conversation. the assembly members started to discuss East Palo Alto and the flood risk in East Palo Alto. And if you currently live in the Bay Area and lived in the Bay Area during the winter 2023 storms, you probably remember that there was a lot of flooding around the region. And in these storms, East Palo Alto experienced pretty significant flooding that was from the San Francisco Creek overtopping. And when the creek overtopped an area, a neighborhood with mostly low-income rent-controlled apartments and single-family homes was flooded. Cars were damaged and destroyed. Personal belongings were lost. And I believe the number from this storm of damages from flooding, from kind of the handful of storms that were happening in winter 2023, January 2023, was about $5 to $7 billion in damages. And in East Palo Alto, and for the community members that experienced this flooding, they were, they lost their vehicle that brought them to work. They had to replace personal belongings and pay for that. And they're still trying to get money from FEMA to cover some of those losses. So this has a really, this investment in Prop 4 investment into flood management has a really personal connection in the Assembly Members District and in our region. And Prop 4 provides $85 million in funding for Bay Area projects to address sea level rise, flood management, and wetland restoration. And this is really critical when, like Joshua said, a lot of our housing stock is at risk. And the last thing I'll say on this is that we're really coming to understand this new risk of groundwater rise. And shallow groundwater rise is freshwater stored in soils below the ground surface. And with sea level rise, groundwater is going to, the depth of the groundwater is going to come up. And so when there are heavy rains, it's more likely for neighborhoods to flood. And we haven't really integrated this risk into our mapping and modeling in a holistic way. And so right now we might be underestimating how much flood risk we have in the Bay Area. So I think this is a really, this bond investment is really critical for meeting that need.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I do want to jump into the other question. So I think I'll just put one point on that, and then we'll get into the specific questions, which is, as Sarah just noted, a lot of the places where we're going to see the flood risk first is going to be stormwater flooding. We'll get to sea level rise flooding in the coming years. We know we need to invest there. But one of the important things that the bond does include is $110 million in grants for local governments to upgrade their storm drain systems in order to help improve that capacity that caused a lot of the flooding that Sarah's talking about in East Palo Alto, and that also regularly causes flooding in other communities around the Bay Area. So let's move into other topics and get into other things. So Nadia, I want to bring you into this and bring SVLG's perspective into this a little bit. So we've talked again about flooding, and I think when people are looking about at their ballots and they're weighing what they're going to vote on, I think the health of the region's economy is obviously a big consideration, especially when you're voting on bonds or things that are going to potentially add cost to the state. But we've talked about how the investments that Prop 4 are going to make are good for the state. I'd be curious to get your take from the business community on how these investments are going to actually support the Bay Area's economy beyond just the flood risk that we talked about. So the whole range of climate risks.
And excellent question. So first, thank you, Save the Bay, for the opportunity to be here. Also, Assemblymember Papan, a pleasure to have you as a part of this conversation as well. I will say, for those who have yet to cross paths with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, on background, we are a membership association that's composed of hundreds of businesses and institutions that work in the tech and innovation sector. So think household names like Google and Microsoft, but also innovators when it comes to bioscience and the health sectors, but also the region's universities, community colleges, a good number of nonprofits, and also startups. So very much that engine that the Assembly member mentioned before of the economy in California, one that leads the nation. And I would say, like, the simple answer for our members in SVLG as to why we believe the time is now to invest is because California is home. It's home both to SVLG and to our members. And we are making significant investments in the state and plan to stay here. And so we acknowledge the risk of inaction, when it comes to not acting, when it comes to mitigating the impacts of climate change, because as mentioned before, we do know and see that there are really tangible economic implications it could have right here in California. We think a lot about it from, our offices, but also the people who live and work in the communities that we look to serve, and also looking at the ripple effects that can happen when, the unexpected happens to businesses, to households, to homes. We talked a little bit about some of the stats that are there, but there are physical assets worth the hundreds of billions located in this region alone. And think of the number of deals and disruptions that could happen in the event that there is a major, climate event. We experience wildfires, we experience sea level rise or flooding, or the water is contaminated. In addition to that, we look at, tens of billions of dollars in potential damages to those very critical infrastructures and assets that sort of power the economy. If you take a click lower, it impacts the households in a very real way. And the households are actually the people who power the economy. Think of, the Microsofts and the Googles of the world are nothing if they don't have the people and the brain power that are working at various levels within the company and the organization, but also being able to engage in the community. So over 75,000 households are estimated to be at risk if we talk about sea level rise alone, but also thinking about the vulnerable communities there. It also would have a ripple impact on, we see numbers in the hundreds of thousands to 200,000 jobs also could be impacted and implicated should there be an event that's not mitigated. And these are jobs in addition to businesses as well that will be, hit and touched hard. So I think for SBLG and for our members, we see the real risk with inaction. And we also know that, in many true tech form, true private sector form, show me your budget and show me your priorities. So being able to put a significant amount of funding towards things in a very strategic and pragmatic way absolutely makes sense for SBLG and our members. So that's how we are looking at it. That's sort of the foundation for our support. And we are definitely hoping that, the voting population, agrees and recognizes that the risks are here. As mentioned, climate change is here, and the time to act and make sure that we are not adversely impacted is now.
And just kind of diving into that answer a little bit more, Nadia, are there any of you just mentioned investing strategically. Can you just, looking at the list of things that this bond is going to support, from your perspective, are there any of the things that we haven't highlighted yet that you really see as some of those critical investments, that are strategic investments?
I would say the one topic that hasn't been highlighted before is the focus on upgrading transmission, and then making sure that we are also looking at renewable energy sources and continuing to reduce, greenhouse gas and other emissions that are there. We know that California is a leader when it comes to establishing these plans, and that these goals are top of mind for our members because many are actively invested in working to help solve those problems and very much aligned with the spirit of those very ambitious climate goals. So I would say having the right grid capacity and then making upgrades to transmission lines, making sure that you can have, the energy and the power brought to those innovators so they can continue to create and build is the second layer of interest from us behind, making sure that we can mitigate the impacts of sea level rise and flooding.
Great. And I've got a couple of questions for Jordan and Sarah too, but I also just wanted to put in a plug. If any of the audience members have specific questions for any of our panelists, including Assemblymember Papan, please again go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So thanks again, Nadia. That was a great answer, and again, a real important thing to note that is something that we don't always focus on, kind of talking about some of the investments on things like electrification and grid upgrades that are equally as important, but as shoreline advocates, we don't always put into our talking points. So thank you. So shifting over to Jordan. Jordan, we've now talked about coastal adaptation. We talked a little bit about wildfire and as Nadia mentioned, some of the electrical grid issues that are needed. But the Bay Area is continuing to face additional climate risks as well. So Greenbelt's really been a strong proponent of nature-based climate adaptation. And I was hoping that you might be able to talk a little bit more about how Prop 4 is investing in these nature-based approaches to protect people that are in the communities from climate risks.
Yeah, sure, Josh. Would be happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jordan with Greenbelt Alliance. For those who don't know us, we are an environmental nonprofit that has been around for the last 66 years here in the Bay Area, focused on the protection of open space, sustainable land use policy, and most critically for our work with the climate bond, really helping communities adapt to our changing climate across the Bay Area. So one of the most exciting things to us about Prop 4 for those of us at Greenbelt is the sheer amount of funding for natural adaptation that includes. It is frankly unprecedented to see this this level of funding for solutions that we are so supportive of. We know that many of the best ways to address climate impacts are through nature itself. And this is an investment in those solutions on a scale that we haven't seen before, and it can't come soon enough. So just to break down the funding a little bit, what are we actually getting out of this from a natural adaptation standpoint? Let's talk about one of the biggest chunks, which is $1.5 billion for wildfire and forest resilience. During our little poll earlier, 47% of you had wildfire at the top of your minds. I know that's very true for us at Greenbelt Alliance as well. When I was growing up here in the Bay Area, wildfire season did not really exist in the way it does today. It wasn't really a thing. And we have seen wildfires increase exponentially in both severity and frequency. So that $1.5 billion is going to go to things like improving forest management, is going to go to clearing vegetation, ensuring that we are setting our forests up for success, that we're managing them well, to ensure that we are not seeing the intensity and severity of wildfires. We're doing the preventative maintenance needed to make sure our forests are healthy. The other thing that this money will go to from a nature-based standpoint with regard to wildfires is creating forest breaks. Greenbelt has been very involved in Greenbelt buffer projects throughout the region, particularly in Santa Rosa, involved in creating these natural spaces, these breaks between fire and our existing communities to allow a buffer in between the place where our communities are, where our people live, and where fire is going to come. We need, quite frankly, the financial component to make those things a practical reality for Californians. So those fire breaks are incredibly important, and that funding from the climate bond will go right there. On extreme heat, we know that another big chunk of the bond money will go to, in fact, $450 million total, will go to dealing with extreme heat. $700 million to things like parks and open space, meaning that we are going to fund the urban greening solutions, the tree canopy that we know we need to increase to ensure that all the sort of urban heat island effects that we have from all the concrete that we have are lessened. This will not only help with urban heat island effects, but with pollution, with so many different things, and the climate bond funds all of these. So tons of important funding in here for nature-based solutions that we know we need right now to deal with our biggest challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. I think that was an incredibly important point, especially on the need for fire breaks for our communities. I mean, we were just seeing here in Oakland another reminder this week about the risk of fire in our communities and the need to be preparing, not just managing the forests up in the Sierra and the northern part of the state, but really here, around the ridgeline of the Bay Area as well. So Sarah, I'd like to come back to you now. The SPUR is a planning agency. You guys do a lot with working with cities on how to build not only just better systems but more resilient systems. And so I'd like to get a sense from you on kind of how the funding that we're talking about is actually going to get to the local level and support the cities in their efforts to build climate resilience, not just these big projects that might be happening at the statewide level.
Yeah, thanks for this question. SPUR since about 2010 has been really focused on sea level rise mitigation and adaptation, and trying to help cities advance sea level rise planning. And so I'll focus on one thing that's in the bond, or one investment that's in the bond that we see as really, really valuable for this. So Prop 4 includes $75 million to replenish SB1, which is the California Sea Level Rise Mitigation and Adaptation Act of 2021. And SB1 directed the state to provide funding to local and regional governments to develop sea level rise adaptation plans and implementation projects. A lot of local governments don't have the funding or capacity to do this on their own, so it's really valuable to have state funding for this. And in the budget this year, there was some funding was maintained for SB1, some funding was delayed to later years. And the challenge with funding being delayed is that you don't know if it's actually going to come in the next fiscal year or not, depending on where we're at in terms of the budget deficit. And so this investment from Prop 4 into SB1 is really valuable, and especially valuable in this moment because in 2023, SB 272 was passed, which requires local jurisdictions to develop these sea level rise adaptation plans. And the Bay Conservation Development Commission is the regulating agency for these plans, which are going to be due in 2034. And BCDC has created a regional shoreline adaptation plan to guide this process. And this is a region-wide plan for the Bay shoreline that creates kind of a process and priorities for coordinated locally planned sea level rise adaptation. And SB1 right now is the main funding source for these plans. So really important that this is funded. And that's going to go to local jurisdictions to move forward this effort and hopefully move forward this effort but before 2034. We want to see these plans happening sooner than that, since a lot of these jurisdictions are already experiencing sea level rise flooding. The last thing I'll say is bond funding is also going to help local jurisdictions match funding for federal grants. Federal grants often require match funding, and Prop 4 will hopefully open up opportunities for local jurisdictions to be able to meet that match funding and access those grants, which, still are happening at the federal level, but we need to get them as soon as possible.
Thanks, Sarah. Now, Assemblymember Papan, I want to come back before we get into some of the audience questions that we've got, because I do think that one of the things that's sort of been an ongoing storyline for the state for the past few years in particular has been this insurance crisis. And this is where the climate crisis really starts to hit, I think, home with people, is when they start seeing insurance policies getting canceled or rates getting increased. And this is something that I know the state is trying to deal with on the legislative, from a legislative standpoint. So I'm just curious, when you're looking at something like Prop 4 and you're looking at a crisis like insurance, where we're seeing both fire and flood insurance policies getting canceled, how does this go to help the state deal with that crisis as well?
Well, I think first and foremost, you're mitigating some of the threats. So certainly that ought to play well with our insurance carriers that are coming in and out of the state at different rates. So I think it really shows a commitment towards mitigating some of these threats. And I want to say this, in the Democratic caucus, there are folks that I'd never really heard from as it related to insurance issues. But I am telling you, they are hearing it from their constituents across the board. And they are very, very nervous. This is affecting, the common man in every single district. And we have, the insurance companies certainly have our attention. So I've long felt like, I know what they will tell you are a couple things. They will say, it's taken us 2 and 3 years to get rate increases. In the meantime, we're bleeding losses. We need you to know that we will be gone in the morning. So I recognize we need to expedite perhaps rate increases, and they wanted to do prospective modeling, which would allow them to perhaps more accurately predict where losses might exist. And all of those things make us, I think, California a state that's trying to be very realistic about what prices should be. But I think the bond itself and the resiliency that the bond opportunity that the bond represents shows a terrific commitment to us being resilient. The southeast portion of the nation is something that is certainly opened everybody's eyes. And when you combine that with what ratepayers are being confronted with, and I am no exception to that, it is scary white knuckle times. So I think that this bond is a win as it relates to how carriers assess risk in this state. Likewise with wildfire, we're really trying, and it is nothing but a positive. Does it solve every problem? Absolutely not. Is it a positive? You bet. And I really appreciate that you're bringing that as part of this discussion and part of why we should all be voting for Prop 4.
Well, we did get a couple of questions that I got sent to me via the chat. So one of them is around measurable goals. I think, I can throw this out to anybody, but when we're looking at these kinds of investments, and we're talking about, having these go through existing programs for the most part again, I think the thrust of this question is how do we make sure, again, there's that accountability? What are we going to get in terms of measurable outcomes? And I guess, from your various perspectives, are there things that you're hoping to see over the next few years that are going to show that investment paying off over time so that people really see the value in their communities? And what would those sorts of things look like?
Well, I think, if I may, not that you're not sick of hearing of me, but there has been some levee work. Granted, they're not the natural wetlands that perhaps might be preferred, but when you look at Foster City, and Foster City decided to tax itself, it spent $90 million to do a levee because they would have been gone in the morning. There's no question about that. I think it's a real quantifiable protection. And I know in my district, we've seen folks that are in the flood zone, which means that they have to pay for flood insurance. And if you do the kind of protections that will get you out of the flood zone, it certainly helps. Likewise, San Mateo did another small levee and a pump station. And it was really our most vulnerable communities who were having to pay this very expensive flood insurance. So there is a response, and a very concrete response, if you can get yourself out of the flood zone by doing certain resiliency work.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're going to see this the most, is when people start seeing the benefits, again, to your home insurance, getting out of the flood zone potentially, starting to see some of these projects go in. I think the project that I showed is a very real, the project that I showed earlier, that little video of a levee being breached, that's a very tangible project. You can go down to the North San Jose and along the shoreline of Menlo Park, and you can see all this work being done. You can see where the funding from Measure AA and the Coastal Conservancy have already been moving dirt, building those levees, building those natural horizontal levees along the shoreline. And so a lot of this is visible work that's being done in our communities. And you're going to see more of it if we have the ability to advance these projects in the short term. And then, I think there was one other question that we got, which was, is this going to raise my taxes? And I think that, I can just go ahead and throw the quick answer on there, unless you want to correct me, Assemblymember. But the answer is no, that this is a general obligation bond. And so this is paid for out of the state's general fund. And so it does not have a direct tax increase associated with it.
You are correct.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure people are aware of that as well. And then we've only got a minute left, or a couple of minutes left. So I guess the last question that we kind of had for everybody, which is, as people are hopefully thinking about this bond and maybe talking to their friends, what's the message that you'd like people to take away to really help them understand why supporting this measure is important in this election? And I'd throw that out to anyone who might have a thought on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think, people who are joining this call very likely care about these issues and are probably thinking that they will vote yes. And it's great to hear from us and learn what's in the bond, but it'd be really helpful if you all talk to your friends and family about this proposition. And one of the kind of numbers that I like to, or statements that I like to talk about is the Federal Emergency Management Agency estimates that for every $1 invested in disaster mitigation and adaptation activities, like what we're going to be investing in with Prop 4, we have $6 in savings in disaster savings, so like avoided disaster damages. And that means for a $10 billion bond where we're investing in mitigation and adaptation measures, that's $60 billion in potential avoided disaster costs. And the bond over the course of its 30 to 40 years of payback is only going to cost the state $16 billion. I think that's a really valuable number to share with people that maybe are uncertain if they want to vote for this bond, are worried about the cost to the state in the long term. It really is going to pay back over time.
Yeah, and just jumping in, I would say the thing that I would say is that the issue is present now. Like, there isn't going to be an aspect of your life that this is not going to touch. And we have an opportunity to not only catch up, but get ahead on some things and mitigate the impacts that we will likely see. So it's one of the situations where we have a rare opportunity to move now. So now's the time to take that action.
Well, thank you. I see that we're at time. I'll turn it back to Allison to close us out, but thank you all.
Well, I think Jordan was going to add something, but
I'm sorry, Jordan, did I cut you off?
he didn't have his unmute, but I would all right. We don't need to be Florida. Thank you, Sarah, for all those numbers too. But I think Jordan wanted to say something real quick.
I was just going to quickly say the question, because the financial aspect comes up a lot. The question is not, can we afford to do this? It's, can we afford not to? We are talking about preventative maintenance here, and we are talking about whether or not if we do this, if we don't do this, will things be more expensive in the future? And the answer is yes. Had we started some of these things 10, 20, 30 years ago, we would not be paying the expenses we are going to have to pay, we are paying and are going to have to pay. And so that is really, in my mind, the way to look at this is, what is the cost if we don't do this? And the answer is that it will be exponentially higher in the future if we don't act now. As environmentalists like to say, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. I know that's cliche, but it's absolutely true when it comes to this bond. And so I encourage all of you to vote yes.
Okay. Well, you took the words right out of my mouth, Jordan. I already put the Proposition 4 website in the chat. Sorry, it's not a hyperlink, but please, Melody fixed that. Check out their website for more information. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Assemblymember Papan, Jordan, Sarah, Nadia. Really appreciate your time and expertise. And we will send out a follow-up with addressing any of the questions we didn't get to. But otherwise, thanks for joining us, and come back for a future climate conversation.